Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching the Today I Found Out YouTube channel, and in the video today, we're looking at the incredible story of Douglas Mawson and his 300-mile trek across the Antarctic. On a brutal Antarctic day in January 1913, without food, dogs, transport or companionship, starving, covered in open sores, and with the soles of his feet attached to his body with only tape, 30-year-old Australian geologist and explorer Douglas Mawson's only remaining motivation for soldiering on was to leave his diary in a place where searchers might eventually find it. Mawson's journey through hell had ironically begun rather auspiciously. As the leader of the Australasian Antarctic expedition, Mawson and his 31-man crew landed on January 8, 1912, at a place they named Cape Denison on Commonwealth Bay, a site later found to be the windiest sea-level place on Earth, with the average wind speed ringing in at a whopping 50 miles per hour, that's 80 kilometers an hour. The crew established themselves a base there, essentially a hut on a rocky cape, as well as another to the west on the Queen Mary Lake ice shelf. Their relief ship, the Aurora, was not scheduled to return until January 15, 1914. Well provisioned, the men survived the coming winter, which featured blizzards with wind speeds topping out at close to 200 miles per hour, that's 322 kilometers an hour. Mawson said of having to go outside in some of these, "A plunge into the writhing storm well stamps upon the senses an indelible and awful impression seldom equalled in the whole gamut of natural experience. The world of void, grisly, fierce, and appalling. We stumble through the Stygian gloom, the merciless blast, an incubus of vengeance, stabs, buffets, and freezes. The stinging drift blinds and chokes." As the year went on and the storms waned, they prepared to take advantage of the relatively pleasant Antarctic summer, which lasts from around late November through February, in order to explore the previously uncharted surrounding territory. Splitting into 8 three-man teams, with the remaining crew staying behind to tend the camps, Mawson's Far Eastern party included a Swiss skiing champion, 29-year-old Xavier Mertz, and a member of the British Royal Fusiliers, 25-year-old Belgrave Ninnis. Setting off on November 10, 1912, Mawson's party made great time, and a month later they were 300 miles from Camp Denison. Having crossed 2 glaciers and dozens of deadly crevasses, where thin bridges of snow spanned and often hid the abyss below, the men were beginning to think of heading back, needing to return at the latest by January 15th, when the Aurora would arrive to pick them up. But then tragedy struck on December 14th, 1912. At about noon, Mertz, who skied ahead as a scout for the other 2, who were driving sledges pulled by huskies, stopped and signaled that another crevasse was in their path. In the lead, Mawson had no trouble traversing a discovered snow bridge. He then glanced back to make sure Ninnis had adjusted his path to follow the safe course behind him, and he had. Pushing on and facing front, Mawson was surprised to notice Mertz had stopped and was heading back toward him, looking alarmed. Looking back himself, Mawson was shocked to see no sign of Ninnis, his sledge, or his 6 dogs. Rushing back on foot alongside Mertz, together the 2 soon reached an 11-foot hole in the surface of the snow, with 2 sets of tracks leading up to it, and only one leading away. Taking turns roping up and creeping to the delicate lip of the hole, they leaned over the edge in an attempt to find their companion. However, the only survivor they saw was a suffering dog, as well as a dead one, both approximately 150 feet below the surface. Despite 3 hours of desperate calling and listening, there was no sign of Ninnis, and with too little rope to reach even the 150-foot shelf, they had to accept that Ninnis was lost. Poor planning had made things worse. You see, rather than divvy up the supplies evenly between the 2 sleds, Ninnis' sled contains their 3-man tent. Most of the people food, all but 10 days' rations, all of the dog food, and their 6 best dogs. The men turned their sled runners, Mertz's skis, and a spare tent cover into an improvised cramped tent, and spent that first desperate night planning their 315-mile return journey. Over the first few days, while they and the dogs were still relatively well nourished, they made good time on the trek back. However, between the limited food and constant exertion during the remaining weeks of December, their huskies began dropping from exhaustion. As each dog could no longer run, it was placed on the sledge and carried along until they camped. Once the men made camp for the night, the no longer useful dog was killed and butchered. Its meat and offal became food for the men. Whatever was left of this dog was given to the remaining dogs. Nothing was wasted from these animals. Even the dog's toughened paws were ultimately stewed and eaten. Unfortunately for the pair, they didn't know husky liver is extremely high in vitamin A, a nutrient that in excessive quantities can lead to severe health problems, and they kept choice bits like that for themselves. They were soon down to 1 dog, so they harnessed themselves and also began to pull with her through the deep, hard snow. Keeping only the most basic of gear, they threw away their rifle, extra runners, alpine rope, and even the camera and film they had used to memorialize their journey. 16 days into their return journey, and only a little over halfway back, Mawson noted, "Xavier off color. We did 15 miles, halting at about 9 a.m. He turned in, all his things very wet. The continuous drift does not give one a chance to drive a thing, and our gear is deplorable. Tent has dripped terribly, all caked with ice. Emaciated and seemingly suffering from hypervitaminosis A, Mertz quickly began to decline. On January the 5th, 1913, at least slightly delusional in an attempt to prove to Mawson that his fingers were not frostbitten, he actually bit off the top of one. Soon after, he refused to go any further. Mawson would not leave Mertz behind and persuaded him to ride on the sledge, now pulled solely by himself. Although they now had travelled 2/3 of the way back, on January the 7th, 1913, they still had 100 miles left to go, and Mertz was in his last hours. Mawson stated, "During the afternoon he has several fits and is delirious, fills his trousers again, and I clean out for him. He is very weak, becomes more and more delirious, rarely being able to speak coherently. At 8 p.m. he raves and breaks a tent pole. I hold him down, then he becomes more peaceful, and I put him quietly in the bag. He dies peacefully at about 2 a.m. on the morning of the 8th. He had lost all the skin of his legs and private parts. I am in the same condition, and sore on finger won't heal." Now alone in one of the loneliest places on Earth, Mawson made a snowblock can for Mertz, cut the sledge in half, and constructed a sail out of Mertz's coat and some other remaining cloth, and he continued on, with nearly no food, his hair falling out in clumps, skin peeling off of his legs, and open sores on his face and body. Within a few days, he discovered to his horror that the soles of his feet had detached, but, ever persistent, he taped them back on and put several pairs of wool socks on and soldiered on. With 80 miles to go, and only a few days to make the January the 15th rendezvous with the Aurora, Mawson's chances were looking increasingly bleak when yet another disaster struck. Breaking through a bridge, he found himself suspended from his sledge over a deadly crevasse, kept from falling by only his harness rope. Luckily, the sledge was firmly stuck, and the rope had knots periodically along its 14-foot length. Summoning his remaining strength, Mawson lunged for the first knot, grabbed it, and pulled his body up. He repeated this feat again and again, exhausting his physical and mental strength. He finally reached the lip of the crevasse, at which point he slipped and plunged back down, again only saved by his harness. Emotionally, figuratively, and literally at the end of his rope, Mawson was considering untying himself and just ending it all by falling into the crevasse. Below was a black chasm. Exhausted, weak, and chilled, for my hands were bare and pounds of snow had got inside my clothing, I hung with the firm conviction that all was over except the passing. It would be but the work of a moment to slip from the harness, then all the pain and toil would be over. But then he recalled a verse from Robert Service's poem The Quitter. Just have one more try. It's dead easy to die, it's the keeping on living that's hard. Giving it one last tremendous effort, Mawson again climbed the rope. My strength was ebbing fast. In a few moments, it would be too late. The struggle occupied some time, but by a miracle, I rose slowly to the surface. This time I emerged feet first and pushed myself out. Then came the reaction, and I could do nothing for quite an hour. And later he wrote, "For hours I lay in the bag, rolling over in my mind all that lay behind and the chance of the future. I seemed to stand alone on the wide shores of the world. My physical condition was such that I felt I might collapse at any moment. Several of my toes commenced to blacken and fester near the tips, and the nails worked loose. There appeared to be little hope. It was easy to sleep on in the bag, and the weather was cruel outside." Assuming the Aurora had already left and believing he was doomed, Mawson continued on with the thin hope that he would reach a place where he could leave his and Mertz's diaries so that others would learn their fate. Yet hope sprung anew on January the 29th, 1913, when Mawson discovered a cloth-covered stash of food with a note from members of his party who had been searching for his little group and had left only hours before. Beyond the food, the note stated that the Aurora was still waiting for him. Only 28 miles from Camp Denison at this point, it still took him 10 days to reach the base, partly due to his weakened state despite the extra supplies, but also due to a blizzard that kept him stranded in a cave for nearly a week just a few miles from the main camp. When he did emerge from the cave and made the final push to the waiting ship, the sight he saw was the Aurora off in the distance sailing away. He had missed it by only a matter of hours. But this was not the end. 6 of his colleagues had volunteered to remain behind to search for the missing party. Upon Mawson's arrival, the small group attempted to call the Aurora back via a wireless telegraph, but due to the ever-worsening weather, the ship could not return nor remain, so sailed home. Forced to spend another winter on the frozen continent, the well-provisioned group made good use of their time, performing additional scientific research, including studying the Aurora Australis, mapping the region further, and discovering the first meteorites in Antarctica, among other things. Through it all, they were able to communicate with the outside world via experimenting with long-range wireless transmissions. Despite the work and now plentiful supplies, it took Mawson some time to mentally recover from his ordeal. He stated, I find my nerves in a very serious state, and from the feeling I have in the base of my head, I have the suspicion that I may go off my rocker very soon. My nerves have evidently had a very great shock. Mawson returned to Australia in February of 1914. For his work exploring Antarctica, he received the Founders Gold Medal in 1915 and the David Livingstone Centenary Medal in 1916. He also wrote a fascinating account of his ordeal in 1915, The Home of the Blizzard. A more recent account of Mawson's expedition was actually published in 2013 by David Roberts. It's called Alone on the Ice, the greatest survival story in the history of exploration. He married and was knighted in 1914, served as a major in the British Army during World War I, became a professor at the University of Adelaide, and even returned to Antarctica in 1929 to 1931. He died from a stroke on October 14, 1958, at the age of 76. Today, his visage can be found on the Australian $100 banknote. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that like button below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already for brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also, over there on the right are a couple of other videos that you might enjoy if you enjoyed this one, and thank you for watching.